What would you do if someone threatened you in front of a crowd, thinking you were just another helpless victim? Most people would back down, call for help, or simply walk away. But what if you possessed skills that could neutralize the threat in seconds? What if years of elite military training had turned your body into a weapon, but nobody around you knew it? This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a decorated Navy SEAL who chose to live quietly after her service, working as a high school teacher in a small coastal town. For 2 years, she kept her past hidden, blending into civilian life like any other educator. But on one fateful evening at a local community event, when 3 aggressive men decided to corner and intimidate her in front of dozens of witnesses, they had no idea they were about to discover what happens when you threaten someone who has been trained to eliminate threats in the world's most dangerous places. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look the most ordinary. Sometimes the quiet teacher in the corner has seen more combat than an entire police force. And sometimes, when pushed too far, even the most peaceful warrior must remind the world why they earned their place among the elite. This is that story. Sarah Martinez wiped the whiteboard clean as the last of her students filed out of the classroom. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Ocean View High School, casting long shadows across the empty desks. At 32, she had the kind of presence that made students listen without her having to raise her voice. There was something in her eyes, a depth, that suggested she had seen more than most people twice her age. "Have a good weekend, Ms. Martinez," called out Jenny, one of her favorite seniors, as she hurried toward the door. "You too, Jenny. Remember, your essay on marine biology is due Monday," Sarah replied with a warm smile that transformed her otherwise serious features. As the hallway grew quiet, Sarah packed her lesson plans into a worn leather messenger bag. The bag had traveled with her to places she never discussed, places that existed only in classified reports and the nightmares that occasionally interrupted her sleep. But that was her old life. Here in the small coastal town of Harbor Bay, California, she was simply Ms. Martinez, the marine biology teacher who had moved here 2 years ago for a fresh start. The truth was far more complicated. Sarah had spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women who had ever earned the coveted trident. She had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, conducting operations that would never make it into any history books. She had saved lives, taken lives, and carried secrets that weighed heavier than any equipment she had ever shouldered into battle. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any military operation she had ever undertaken. The constant vigilance, the hyper-awareness of exits and potential threats, the way her body automatically assessed every person as either friendly or hostile. These habits died hard. Teaching had been her therapist's suggestion. "Find something that gives you purpose but allows you to heal," Dr. Reeves had said during one of their sessions. "Something that lets you use your protective instincts in a positive way." It had worked, mostly. The students gave her a reason to get up every morning, and their energy slowly began to fill the void that military service had left behind. She genuinely cared about their futures, their dreams of becoming marine biologists, environmental scientists, and ocean conservationists. In their enthusiasm, she found echoes of her own younger self, the girl who had dreamed of studying the ocean before life had taken her down a very different path. But Harbor Bay was a small town, and small towns had their own dangers. Sarah had learned this the hard way. The trouble had started 3 months ago when she had witnessed something she was not supposed to see. Walking to her car after a late evening of grading papers, she had noticed unusual activity at the marina. Men in expensive suits were unloading wooden crates from a yacht, their movements quick and nervous. The boat bore no identifying marks, and the men wore latex gloves despite the warm evening. Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. She memorized faces, noted the yacht's approximate length and color, and observed the license plates of the vehicles waiting on the dock. Something about the entire operation screamed illegal activity. When one of the men noticed her watching and pointed in her direction, she had simply nodded politely and gotten into her car, driving away as if she had seen nothing at all. But she had seen everything. The next morning, she had called the local police department and asked to speak with someone about suspicious activity. The desk sergeant had been polite but dismissive. "Probably just some rich folks bringing in supplies for their boat, ma'am. Nothing to worry about." When she pressed for more information about how to file a formal report, she was told that unless she had evidence of actual criminal activity, there was nothing they could do. Sarah had dropped the matter, or so she thought. 2 weeks later, she began noticing the same men around town. One of them, a tall, lean man with graying temples and cold blue eyes, had been in the coffee shop where she bought her morning latte. Another, shorter and stockier, with a neck tattoo barely concealed by his shirt collar, had been at the grocery store where she did her weekly shopping. The third, a middle-aged man with a slight limp and expensive watch, had been sitting in his car outside the school one afternoon. At first, Sarah told herself it was coincidence. Harbor Bay was a small place, and it was natural that she would start recognizing faces after living there for 2 years. But her military instincts were screaming otherwise. These men were watching her, and they were not trying very hard to hide it. The intimidation escalated gradually. First, her car tires were slashed while she was teaching. Then her mailbox was vandalized. She came home one evening to find her apartment door slightly ajar, though nothing inside appeared to have been touched. The message was clear. We know where you live, we know your routines, and we can get to you any time we want. Sarah could have handled the situation in any number of ways. She could have contacted the FBI claiming suspected organized crime activity. She could have used her military connections to get the boat's registration traced. She could have disappeared entirely, using skills she had learned in the SEALs to vanish and start over somewhere else. Instead, she chose to stay and wait. Harbor Bay had become her home, and these students had become her responsibility. She was not going to be driven away by common criminals who thought they could intimidate a schoolteacher. But she was not naive about the danger she was in. Sarah began varying her routes to and from school. She started parking in different locations each day. She kept her apartment curtains closed and invested in a state-of-the-art security system. Most importantly, she began carrying herself differently, allowing just a hint of her military bearing to show through her civilian facade. The 3 men noticed the change, and they did not like it. The confrontation came on a Friday evening in October. Harbor Bay was hosting its annual Autumn Festival, a community event that drew residents and tourists alike to the town square. Sarah had volunteered to help with the marine conservation booth, spending the evening talking to families about protecting local marine life and the importance of ocean conservation. She was genuinely enjoying herself for the first time in months. The festival reminded her why she had chosen to make Harbor Bay her home. Children ran between booths with cotton candy and balloon animals. Couples strolled hand in hand admiring the local artwork, and elderly residents shared stories with anyone willing to listen. It was the kind of small-town America that she had fought to protect during her years in the military. As the evening wound down and volunteers began cleaning up their booths, Sarah noticed the 3 men approaching. They had positioned themselves strategically, cutting off her access to the main crowd and the parking area. The tall man with graying temples took the lead, his expensive suit incongruous among the casual festival attire of everyone else. Sarah Martinez, he said, his voice carrying just enough volume that nearby volunteers could hear. We need to talk. Sarah continued folding the educational posters she had displayed, keeping her movements calm and controlled.
I'm sorry, do I know you?
The stockier man with the neck tattoo stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. You know exactly who we are, lady, and you know what this is about. The third man, the one with the limp, positioned himself to block her view of the festival cleanup crew. To anyone watching, it would look like a normal conversation. But Sarah could feel the threat radiating from all 3 men like heat from a fire. I'm afraid I don't, she replied evenly, continuing to pack up her materials. But if you have something specific you'd like to discuss, perhaps we could do it during normal business hours. The tall man's smile was cold and predatory. This is exactly the kind of smart mouth that's going to get you in trouble, sweetheart. You saw something you weren't supposed to see, and now you're going to learn what happens to people who can't mind their own business. Around them, families were loading children into cars, and couples were walking hand in hand toward the parking area. The festival was winding down, but there were still plenty of witnesses. Sarah realized that was exactly what these men were counting on. They wanted to humiliate her publicly, to make it clear that she was powerless and alone. I don't know what you think I saw, Sarah said quietly, but I can assure you that I mind my own business very well. The man with the neck tattoo laughed harshly. That's not what our sources tell us. They tell us you've been asking questions about things that don't concern you. Making phone calls to people who don't need to hear from you. Sarah's hands stilled on the poster she was folding. These men knew about her call to the police department. They had connections inside local law enforcement, which explained why her report had been dismissed so easily. The situation was worse than she had realized. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding, she began. But the tall man cut her off. There's no misunderstanding, Teach. You're going to stop asking questions, stop making phone calls, and stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. And if you don't, well, he let the threat hang in the air. The man with the limp spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow more menacing than if he had shouted. Nice little life you've built here, Sarah. Nice school, nice students, nice quiet apartment. Would be a real shame if something happened to disturb all that peace and quiet. Sarah felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced in Afghanistan when enemy combatants had threatened civilians under her protection, the same controlled rage that had made her one of the most effective operators in her unit. She straightened slowly, setting down the poster and turning to face the three men fully. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that made all three of them take an unconscious step backward. Gentlemen, she said, the word carrying no warmth whatsoever, I think you should leave now. The tall man's eyes narrowed. Did you just threaten us, lady? I made a suggestion, Sarah replied calmly. But if you'd prefer to think of it as something else, that's your choice. The stocky man with the neck tattoo moved closer, close enough that Sarah could smell his cologne and see the gold caps on his teeth. You think you're tough, Teach? You think because you talk tough you can handle what we're offering? Sarah smiled then, an expression that never reached her eyes. I think you gentlemen have no idea what you're dealing with. Is that right? The man with the limp had pulled out his cell phone and was holding it casually, but Sarah noticed his thumb hovering over the screen. Maybe we should call some friends, let them know where to find Harbor Bay's newest troublemaker. The threat was clear. These men had backup, connections, and resources that a simple schoolteacher could never match. They expected her to fold, to apologize, to promise to keep quiet and never cause them trouble again. Instead, Sarah took a single step forward. The movement was so smooth, so controlled, that the three men barely registered it until she was close enough to touch. But something in the way she moved, something in the sudden predatory grace of her posture, made every instinct they possessed scream danger. Before you make that phone call, Sarah said quietly, you might want to ask yourselves one question. What question? The tall man demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Sarah's smile widened slightly. You might want to ask yourselves why a marine biology teacher moves like that. The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. The three men stared at Sarah, suddenly aware that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between them. The quiet schoolteacher who had been folding posters moments before had transformed into something else entirely. The tall man with graying temples recovered first, but his laugh sounded forced. What are you trying to say, lady? That you took some self-defense classes at the local gym? Sarah's posture remained relaxed, but there was a coiled tension in her stance that reminded anyone with combat experience of a loaded spring. I'm saying you gentlemen might want to reconsider your approach. The stocky man with the neck tattoo scoffed and moved even closer. Close enough that he was clearly violating her personal space. Listen, sweetheart. I don't know what kind of tough girl act you think you're putting on, but you're talking to the wrong people. We eat little school teachers like you for breakfast. Around them, the festival cleanup continued. Parents were loading tired children into minivans. Elderly couples were walking slowly toward their cars, and teenagers were gathering in small groups to plan their evening activities. The normalcy of it all made the confrontation seem surreal, like a scene from a movie playing out in the middle of someone's everyday life. Is everything all right over here? The voice belonged to Officer Danny Rodriguez, a young Harbor Bay police officer who had been working festival security. He approached the group with the careful casualness that cops used when they sensed trouble but weren't quite sure what they were dealing with. The tall man's smile returned, confident and predatory. Everything's fine, officer. Just having a friendly conversation with Ms. Martinez here about community involvement. Officer Rodriguez looked between the four adults, his instincts clearly telling him that something was off. Sarah could see him taking in the positioning, the body language, the way the three men had arranged themselves around her. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. "Mrs. Martinez?" Rodriguez said, giving her an opening to speak. Sarah could have ended it right there. She could have told the officer that these men were harassing her, explained about the threats, asked for an escort to her car. It would have been the normal, civilian response to the situation. Instead, she smiled politely. "Everything's fine, Officer Rodriguez. These gentlemen were just leaving." The man with the limp stepped forward, emboldened by what he perceived as Sarah's weakness.
Actually, officer, we're not quite finished with our conversation.
"Ms. Martinez and we have some business to discuss." "What kind of business?" Rodriguez asked, his hand moving unconsciously toward his radio. "Private business?" the stocky man said with a grin that showed too many teeth. "The kind that doesn't concern local law enforcement." Sarah watched the interaction with growing concern. Officer Rodriguez was young and eager, but he was also alone and outnumbered. If this situation escalated, there was a real chance that an innocent police officer could get hurt. She could not let that happen. "Officer Rodriguez," she said calmly, "thank you for checking on us. I was just explaining to these gentlemen that I need to finish cleaning up my booth and get home. Long day." The young officer looked uncertain, clearly sensing that something was wrong but unable to put his finger on exactly what. "Are you sure, ma'am? I can stick around if you need me to." "That won't be necessary," the tall man said smoothly. "Like the lady said, we're just finishing up our conversation." Rodriguez hesitated for another moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right. Well, I'll be around the square for another hour or so if anyone needs anything." He walked away, but Sarah noticed he kept glancing back over his shoulder. The moment the officer was out of earshot, the dynamic shifted again. The three men closed ranks around Sarah, their pretense of civility dropping away like masks. "Smart move keeping the cop out of it," the man with the limp said. "Shows you're finally starting to understand how this works." "Now we can have a real conversation," the stocky man added, cracking his knuckles in a gesture that was meant to be intimidating. Sarah finished folding the last poster and placed it in the storage box with movements that were almost meditative in their precision. "Actually, gentlemen, I think we've said everything that needs to be said." The tall man's patience finally snapped. "No, we haven't said nearly enough. You're going to listen very carefully to what we tell you, and you're going to do exactly what we say, or you're going to find out what happens to people who cross us." "And what exactly happens to people who cross you?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. The question seemed to catch the three men off guard. They had been expecting fear, pleading, or promises to comply. They had not been expecting calm curiosity. "Bad things," the man with the limp said eventually. "Very bad things." Sarah nodded as if this was useful information. "Could you be more specific?" The stocky man stepped forward until he was close enough that Sarah could feel his breath on her face. "Lady, you are seriously starting to piss me off. I think you need a demonstration of what we're capable of." He reached out to grab her arm, intending to twist it behind her back in a move designed to cause pain and establish dominance. It was a technique he had probably used successfully dozens of times on other victims. His hand never made contact. Sarah moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of violence. Her left hand intercepted his reaching arm, deflecting it outward while her right hand struck his wrist with surgical accuracy. The stocky man's hand went numb instantly, and he staggered backward with a look of shock and confusion. "What the hell?" he began, but Sarah was already moving. She stepped inside his guard and placed one hand on his chest, the other on his shoulder. To anyone watching from a distance, it would have looked like she was steadying him after he stumbled. In reality, she was demonstrating just how easily she could control his balance and positioning. "I think," she said conversationally, "that you gentlemen may have made some incorrect assumptions about me." The tall man and the man with the limp were staring at their associate, who was still shaking his hand and trying to get feeling back into his fingers. What had just happened didn't fit into any of their mental categories for how this encounter was supposed to go. "You got lucky," the tall man said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah released the stocky man and stepped back, giving him room to recover. "Did I?" The man with the limp pulled out his cell phone again. "That's it. I'm calling this in." You just assaulted our friend here. Actually, Sarah said mildly, I prevented your friend from assaulting me. There's a difference. Nobody's going to see it that way, the tall man snarled. Especially not when we tell them how you attacked 3 innocent businessmen who were just trying to have a conversation. Sarah looked around the festival grounds, noting the positions of the remaining cleanup volunteers, the lighting, the exit routes, and the location of Officer Rodriguez, who was now helping an elderly couple load folding chairs into their car. Her tactical assessment was automatic and complete. You're welcome to try that approach, she said. But before you do, you might want to consider what story I'll tell. What story? The stocky man demanded, still flexing his fingers. The story about 3 men with connections to drug smuggling who cornered a schoolteacher at a public event and threatened her with physical violence when she wouldn't be intimidated into silence. The 3 men went very still. Sarah could see the calculations running behind their eyes, weighing risks and benefits, trying to figure out how much she actually knew and how much she was guessing. You don't know anything, the tall man said finally. Don't I? Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying their faces with the same clinical attention she had once used to analyze enemy positions. Wooden crates, no manifest, latex gloves on a warm evening, cash transactions, no paperwork trail. A yacht with no identifying markers and a crew that changes the boat's appearance every time it comes into port. The color drained from all 3 faces. Sarah had just described details that only someone with extensive surveillance training could have observed and remembered. Who are you? The man with the limp whispered. Sarah smiled, and for the first time that evening, it was a genuinely warm expression. I'm exactly who I said I am. I'm a marine biology teacher who moved to Harbor Bay for a fresh start. The question is, who are you? We're businessmen, the tall man said weakly. What kind of business? Import-export. What kind of imports? They were clearly out of their depth, dealing with someone who was asking questions with the persistence of a trained interrogator. Look, the stocky man said, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Maybe we can work something out. What kind of something?
You forget what you saw. We forget this conversation ever happened.
Everybody goes home happy. Sarah considered this for a moment. And what guarantee do I have that you'll keep your end of the bargain? You have our word, the man with the limp said. Sarah laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. Your word. The word of 3 men who threatened a schoolteacher at a children's festival. Forgive me if I'm not particularly reassured. The tall man's composure finally cracked completely. Listen, you mouthy bitch, you're going to do what we tell you to do, or we're going to make your life very uncomfortable. We know where you work, we know where you live, and we know how to make people disappear. The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around them, the last of the festival cleanup continued, families and couples and children going about their normal lives, unaware that a completely different kind of conversation was taking place 20 feet away. Sarah looked at each of the 3 men in turn, memorizing their faces, their postures, their tells. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had given orders in life-and-death situations. Let me make something very clear to you, gentlemen. I am not going to be intimidated. I am not going to be threatened. And I am definitely not going to be made to disappear by 3 small-time criminals who think they can scare a schoolteacher into submission. You think you're tough? The stocky man snarled, his ego still bruised from their earlier interaction. Sarah's smile returned, predatory and cold. I think you have no idea what tough looks like. The man with the limp stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. Maybe it's time we showed you. He reached into his jacket, and Sarah saw the outline of a weapon. In that instant, everything changed. The civilized pretense dropped away completely, and Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always descended on her in combat situations. I wouldn't do that if I were you, she said quietly. Why not? He asked, his hand still moving toward his weapon. Sarah's answer came not in words, but in movement. She shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, adjusting her stance in a way that put her in perfect position to neutralize all 3 threats in a matter of seconds. The movement was so subtle that a civilian would never have noticed it. But the man with the limp had spent time around violence. He recognized predatory body language when he saw it, and what he saw in Sarah's posture made his blood run cold. "Because," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're not dealing with a school teacher anymore." The man with the limp froze, his hand halfway to his weapon. Something in Sarah's voice and the way she held herself had triggered every survival instinct he possessed. He had heard that tone before, in Afghanistan, from soldiers who had seen too much combat and lost too many friends. It was the voice of someone for whom violence was not a threat but a tool. Sarah. The voice came from behind the three men. Tom Chen, the high school's principal, was approaching with a concerned expression. He had noticed the tense group from across the square and decided to investigate. "Principal Chen," Sarah said warmly, though she never took her eyes off the three men. "How did you enjoy the festival?" Tom Chen was a perceptive man who had spent 15 years in education dealing with everything from teenage drama to genuine crisis situations. He immediately recognized the signs of a confrontation in progress. "It was wonderful," he replied carefully, studying the three men who had arranged themselves around his marine biology teacher. "Is everything all right over here?" The tall man with graying temples forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Just fine. We were having a discussion with Ms. Perfect, Martinez, about ocean conservation." "Ocean conservation," Tom repeated, his tone suggesting he found this explanation less than convincing. "At 9:30 in the evening, surrounding one of my teachers." The stocky man with the neck tattoo shifted uncomfortably. The last thing they needed was more attention from school officials who might ask uncomfortable questions. "We should probably be going," the man with the limp said, slowly removing his hand from his jacket. "Long drive ahead of us." Sarah nodded pleasantly. "That's probably wise. Harbor Bay can be dangerous for people who don't understand the local currents." The three men exchanged glances, recognizing the warning for what it was. They began to back away, but the tall man couldn't resist one final attempt at intimidation. "This conversation isn't over, Ms. Serchel. Martinez, we'll be seeing you again." "I'm sure you will," Sarah replied calmly. "But next time, gentlemen, I suggest you do your homework first." Tom Chen watched the three men walk away, noting their expensive clothes, their aggressive body language, and the way they kept looking back over their shoulders. When they were finally out of earshot, he turned to Sarah with concern written across his features. "Sarah, who were those men? And don't tell me they were interested in ocean conservation." Sarah finished packing the last of her booth materials, buying herself time to think. Tom Chen was a good man and a good principal, but he was also a civilian who had never dealt with anything more dangerous than an angry parent at a school board meeting. How could she explain the situation without putting him in danger? "They were businessmen who thought I had information that might be valuable to their competitors," she said finally. "I convinced them they were mistaken." Tom studied her face, noting the controlled calm that never seemed to leave her expression, the way she moved with unconscious precision, the fact that she had faced down three aggressive men without showing any sign of fear. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what did you do before you became a teacher?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah had been expecting it for 2 years, ever since she had first walked into Harbor Bay High School with credentials that were impressive but vague, references from people who could not be contacted directly, and a background that seemed to have gaps in all the wrong places. "I served in the military," she said eventually. "What branch?" "Navy." "What did you do in the Navy?" Sarah looked around the festival grounds, now almost empty except for the cleanup crews and a few teenagers who were reluctant to see the evening end. Officer Rodriguez was still visible in the distance, helping volunteers load equipment into trucks. Everything looked normal and peaceful, but Sarah knew that appearances could be deceiving. "I did things that prepared me for situations like this," she said finally. Tom Chen was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had told him and what she had left unsaid. As a principal, he had developed a talent for reading between the lines of student excuses and parent explanations. Sarah's non-answer told him more than a detailed confession would have. "Are you in danger?" he asked directly. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Maybe. Probably not from them, not anymore. What can I do to help?" The question surprised Sarah. She had become accustomed to handling problems alone, to being the solution rather than the person who needed assistance. The offer of help from a civilian colleague was both touching and concerning. "Nothing," she said immediately. "This is my problem to solve. Sarah, you're part of this community now. You're part of our school family. If someone is threatening you, that makes it our problem too." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest, an emotion she had not experienced in years. During her time in the SEALs, she had learned to compartmentalize, to separate her professional life from her personal feelings. But Tom's words reminded her that she was no longer a soldier. She was a teacher, a community member, someone who belonged somewhere. "I appreciate that," she said. "But these men are dangerous, and I don't want anyone else to get hurt." "How dangerous?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "The kind of dangerous that requires federal intervention." Tom's eyes widened slightly. "Then shouldn't we call the FBI?" "I'm going to handle it through other channels," Sarah said. "Channels that are better equipped to deal with this kind of situation." "What kind of channels?" Sarah was saved from answering by the approach of Officer Rodriguez, who had apparently decided to check on them one more time. "Excuse me, Ms. Martinez," he said as he joined them. "I wanted to follow up on that situation earlier. Those men you were talking to, they left the festival grounds, but I saw them sitting in a car in the parking lot of the marina. They've been there for about 20 minutes. Sarah felt her military training kick in automatically. The men were conducting surveillance, possibly planning their next move. They might be waiting for her to leave the festival so they could follow her home. Or they might be calling for backup. "Officer Rodriguez," she said, "how well do you know the other officers in your department?" The young policeman looked surprised by the question. "Pretty well. It's a small department. Why? Have any of them seemed unusually interested in my activities recently? Asked questions about me? Wanted to know about reports I might have filed?" Rodriguez's expression grew concerned. "Are you suggesting that someone in my department might be compromised?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Sarah said carefully. "I'm asking if you've noticed anything unusual." The officer thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Actually, yes. Sergeant Kowalski asked me about you last week, but wanted to know if you'd been involved in any incidents, filed any complaints. I thought it was odd because there was no paperwork to suggest you'd had any contact with the department." Sarah and Tom exchanged glances. If the smugglers had connections inside the local police department, the situation was more complicated than Sarah had initially realized. "Officer Rodriguez," Sarah said, "I need to ask you to do something, and I need you to do it without asking questions or discussing it with anyone else in your department. Ma'am, I can't promise to keep secrets from my supervisors if there's criminal activity involved. I'm asking you to be very careful about who you trust with information until we know the scope of the problem." Rodriguez looked between Sarah and Tom, clearly trying to decide whether he was dealing with paranoid civilians or a genuine law enforcement concern. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally. Sarah pulled out her cell phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. "I'm going to give you a phone number. I want you to call it tomorrow morning and ask to speak with Agent Patricia Williams at the DEA. Tell her that Trident sends her regards and that the Harbor Bay situation requires immediate attention." Rodriguez stared at the phone number Sarah had written on a piece of paper. "Trident. Just tell her exactly what I said. She'll understand." Tom Chen was watching this exchange with growing amazement. His quiet marine biology teacher was giving instructions to a police officer, like someone who was accustomed to coordinating with federal law enforcement. "Sarah," he said quietly, "just what exactly did you do in the Navy?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and her expression hardened. "What is it?" Tom asked. Sarah showed him the message. "Nice festival. Hope you enjoyed it. Next time we meet, bring your principal friend. He looks like he cares about you. Would be a shame if something happened to him." Officer Rodriguez read the message over Tom's shoulder, and his hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. "That's a direct threat against both of you. I can arrest these men right now." "On what evidence?" Sarah asked. The text came from an untraceable phone number. "Even if you could prove they sent it, a good lawyer would argue it was ambiguous language that doesn't constitute a specific threat." "Then what do we do?" Tom asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. She had hoped to handle this situation quietly, to neutralize the threat without revealing her background or involving innocent civilians. But the smugglers had escalated by threatening Tom, and that changed everything. "We end this," she said finally.
How? Sarah looked around the festival grounds one more time, making sure they weren't being observed.
Then she turned to face both men, and when she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat situations. "Officer Rodriguez, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is classified information that could endanger lives if it's shared with the wrong people. Can I trust you to keep this between us until the situation is resolved?" Rodriguez nodded, though he looked uncertain about what he was agreeing to. "Tom, the same goes for you. What I'm about to share with you will explain everything, but it will also make you a target if these men find out you know the truth." Tom Chen squared his shoulders in a gesture that reminded Sarah of her students when they were determined to face a difficult challenge. "Tell us." Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. "My name is Sarah Martinez, and for 8 years I was a United States Navy SEAL. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, conducting classified operations against high-value targets. I have received commendations for actions that will never be made public and participated in missions that officially never happened." Officer Rodriguez's mouth fell open. Tom Chen just nodded, as if this information explained everything he had wondered about for the past 2 years. "I moved to Harbor Bay to start a new life as a civilian," Sarah continued. "But 3 months ago, I witnessed what I believed to be a drug smuggling operation involving those 3 men and others. They've been threatening me to keep quiet, and now they've escalated to threatening people I care about." "What are we going to do?" Tom asked. Sarah's smile was predatory and cold, the expression of someone who had spent years hunting the world's most dangerous people. "We're going to remind them that threatening a Navy SEAL is the kind of mistake you only get to make once." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. "Agent Williams," she said when the call connected. "This is Sarah Martinez. You remember me as Petty Officer Martinez from the Kandahar operation. I need to activate Protocol 7 for a domestic situation that has escalated beyond local law enforcement capability." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah continued. "Harbor Bay, California. 3 suspects with connections to local law enforcement. Drug smuggling operation, possibly cocaine or heroin based on the crate sizes and handling procedures." Another pause. "Understood. I'll secure the civilians and maintain surveillance until your team arrives. How long?" Sarah listened to the response, then nodded with satisfaction. "Copy that. And Agent Williams? Tell the team that this one's personal." She hung up the phone and turned to face Tom and Officer Rodriguez, who were both staring at her with expressions of amazement and concern. "Federal agents will be here within 6 hours," she announced. "Until then, we need to make sure these men don't have a chance to destroy evidence or hurt anyone else." "What do you need us to do?" Tom asked. Sarah looked toward the marina where the 3 men were still conducting surveillance from their car. Her expression was calm and controlled, but there was something in her eyes that had not been there when she was simply Ms. Martinez, the marine biology teacher. "Help me show them what happens when you threaten the wrong person," she said. The quiet teacher was gone. In her place stood someone who had earned the right to wear the Navy SEAL trident. Someone who had spent years protecting others, from the kind of men who thought they could intimidate and threaten innocent people with impunity. The 3 men at the marina had no idea that they were about to discover the difference between a school teacher and a warrior.